A clash of worlds. Michael Thompson stood, almost statue-like, at the reception desk of the Oak Ridge Hotel, staring down at the polished surface in front of him. His hands were clasped firmly, knuckles slightly white from the tension. He had always been a man of control, someone who had built his empire from nothing, climbing every rung of the ladder with a sense of meticulous precision. At 45, he was proud of his achievements, but he carried with him a quiet arrogance, a belief that his standards, his expectations, were the very reason for his success. Every corner of the Oak Ridge gleamed with opulence. The grand chandelier in the center of the lobby sparkled like a constellation, casting a warm glow across the marble floors. The soft hum of the grand piano added a touch of elegance, filling the space with soothing music as guests wandered about, exchanging pleasantries or engaged in light conversation. It was an air of exclusivity that Michael had worked tirelessly to maintain. The Oak Ridge wasn't just a place to stay, it was a reflection of a lifestyle, an identity. He surveyed the guests with a sense of satisfaction, his gaze sweeping over well-dressed individuals who carried themselves with an air of sophistication. For years, Michael had been the architect of the hotel's identity, an institution that catered to those of a certain social standing. He had learned early on that to succeed in the world of luxury hospitality, it wasn't enough to provide excellent service and high-end amenities. You had to curate an atmosphere, an image. The hotel had to embody a very specific kind of elegance, the kind that only a select few could afford. As Michael looked around, he saw the kind of people who fit his definition of acceptable clientele. Wealthy businessmen in crisp suits, polished women in glamorous dresses, all of them sharing an unspoken understanding that they were part of something rarefied, something exclusive. This was the kind of person Michael had always aspired to be, someone who was revered, respected, and admired for their success. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the front doors opening, followed by the sound of footsteps on the marble floor. Michael glanced up, his gaze flicking over the new arrival. At first, he didn't think much of it. A woman, perhaps in her early 30s, dressed simply in a well-worn coat and a pair of boots that had seen better days. She had the kind of face that didn't immediately demand attention. A sharp nose, high cheekbones, and eyes that held an air of determination, but there was nothing about her that screamed luxury. The woman approached the desk, her hands clutching a small worn suitcase. Michael's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. She didn't belong here. There was something about her that immediately set her apart from the polished guests who populated his hotel. "Excuse me," the woman said softly, her voice tentative but clear. "I have a reservation under the name Williams. I'm here for the business conference this weekend." Michael didn't immediately respond. He took his time to glance at her, then returned his gaze to the computer screen in front of him, deliberately typing in her name with a practiced air. The keys clicked in quick succession as he scanned the reservation. "Ah, yes," he said, looking up at her with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ms. Williams, I see that your reservation is in order. However, I must point out that you've arrived a bit earlier than expected. The conference doesn't start for another few hours." The woman nodded, her expression one of polite confusion. "I know. I just wanted to check in early, if that's possible. I didn't want to be rushed later. I've traveled quite a distance to be here." Michael paused, his fingers hovering over the keys as if he were considering something. He stared at her, his gaze lingering a bit longer than necessary. It was almost as if he was sizing her up, assessing whether she was worthy of being in the same space as the elite that frequented his hotel. "While I understand your enthusiasm, Ms. Williams," he began, his voice turning a little colder, "you do realize this is the Oak Ridge Hotel, right? We pride ourselves on offering the finest accommodations for the most distinguished guests." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Michael's tone was polite, but there was an underlying judgment that seeped through, one that was both subtle and deliberate. The woman, Sarah Williams, seemed to pick up on the underlying message. Her brow furrowed, though she maintained her composure. "Yes, I understand," she replied, her voice steady, but now tinged with a quiet determination. "But I've made a reservation, and I believe I'm entitled to the same treatment as any other guest." Michael's lips curled into a smile, though it lacked warmth. "Of course. But you must understand, Ms. Williams, we do have certain standards here. The Oak Ridge is an exclusive establishment, meant for people who, well, let's say, people who appreciate the finer things in life. People who belong, in every sense of the word." Sarah's heart sank, but she refused to show any signs of weakness. "I am here for business," she said firmly, locking eyes with him. "I don't need to fit some specific image to do my job." Michael's expression hardened, the smile fading into a thin line. He motioned toward the bellhop, who stood nearby, awaiting orders. "Well, Ms. Williams, we pride ourselves on offering only the best. Unfortunately, this hotel isn't designed for people who aren't part of that particular circle. I'm afraid we'll have to cancel your reservation." Sarah blinked, momentarily stunned. The words didn't quite make sense. She had never been treated like this before. Never. "What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice rising in disbelief. "I've paid for this reservation. You can't just." Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm afraid it's non-negotiable. You see, we simply can't have someone who doesn't align with the image of the Oak Ridge staying here. I'm sure you'll find somewhere more suitable for your needs." The air around them seemed to grow thicker as Sarah tried to process what was happening. The lobby, once a sanctuary of peace and quiet, now felt suffocating, like a cold and indifferent place where she wasn't welcome. Her eyes flicked to the guests around her, all of whom were now quietly observing the exchange, their glances sharp and judgmental. Michael's words stung, but what stung even more was the knowledge that she was being dismissed based solely on the way she looked, on what she didn't have, on what she couldn't offer. It was as if her worth as a person, her very presence, was being dictated by a man who believed himself to be the gatekeeper of dignity, the arbiter of who belonged in his world. Despite the weight of the situation, Sarah straightened her back. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She had worked too hard to get here, to get this far, to let a man like Michael decide her worth. "I'll find somewhere else," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "But I won't forget this." As she turned to leave, Michael glanced down at the desk, tapping his fingers rhythmically, not even bothering to look up. He had already dismissed her, already moved on to the next guest, who would fit his definition of what belonged. Sarah stepped out of the Oak Ridge Hotel, her heart racing, but her mind set. She didn't know yet how, but she would make him, and everyone who thought like him, understand that no one could define her value. Not him, not anyone. Little did Michael know, he had just made an enemy, and Sarah would make sure that no one would ever again be treated like she had been. A moment of defiance. The city streets felt colder as Sarah walked away from the Oak Ridge Hotel. The once bright lights of the bustling city now seemed distant, almost mocking. She hadn't expected things to go this way, not in her wildest dreams. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but there was also a strange sense of calm. Something about being forced out of the Oak Ridge had awakened a fire inside her that she didn't know she had. Sarah's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She had been humiliated in front of all those people, guests who had looked on with a mixture of indifference and curiosity, as if she were nothing more than a spectacle. But it wasn't just the shame of being kicked out that burned her. No, what really stung was the casual cruelty of Michael Thompson's words. He hadn't just dismissed her, he had written her off as if her very presence was an affront to the hotel's carefully crafted image. As she made her way through the city's streets, she couldn't help but reflect on her journey here. She had grown up in a small town, raised by parents who worked hard to provide for her and her younger brother. They had taught her the value of determination, resilience, and self-respect. Sarah had spent years earning her place in the business world, slowly climbing the corporate ladder, always keeping her head down and working harder than anyone else. She had been proud of how far she had come, despite the obstacles placed in her path. But today, she had been reminded of the harsh reality that some people would never see her for who she truly was. To Michael Thompson, and to people like him, she was simply someone who didn't fit the mold. Her background, her appearance, the way she dressed, none of it fit the image of the Oak Ridge. And that was enough to make her feel like she didn't belong. As Sarah approached the small, unremarkable inn where she had booked her backup reservation, she tried to shake off the feeling of defeat that clung to her. The building was nothing like the Oak Ridge. There were no crystal chandeliers or marble floors, no grand piano playing softly in the background. Instead, it was a modest structure, its neon sign flickering in the dim light. It wasn't the glamorous experience she had imagined when she booked the conference, but it would have to do. She checked in and found her room, a small but clean space with minimal decoration. The bed was comfortable enough, and the bathroom was functional. It wasn't much, but it was hers for the weekend. Sarah threw her suitcase on the bed and sank down beside it. She needed to clear her head, to think about what had just happened and figure out what to do next. The next few hours were a blur. Sarah attended the conference, sat through the sessions, and spoke with colleagues, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she tried to focus, Michael's smug face appeared in her mind's eye. The way he had dismissed her, as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. The way he had talked down to her, as though her worth was somehow lesser because of the way she looked or the life she led. That night, Sarah returned to her room, exhausted and overwhelmed. She dropped her conference materials onto the desk and sat down by the window, staring out at the city lights. Her thoughts turned to the injustice she had experienced, and something inside her snapped. No, she wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let Michael Thompson and people like him get away with treating others this way. Not when there was something she could do about it. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Vanessa. "Hey girl, are you okay? I saw the news. What happened? You have to tell me everything." Sarah let out a deep breath. She didn't want to talk about it, but at the same time, she needed someone to hear her out. She quickly typed a response. "It's a long story. I got kicked out of the Oak Ridge. Michael Thompson, the manager, said I don't belong there, that I don't fit their image." Vanessa's reply was instant. "What? That's insane. You have to do something about this, Sarah. You can't just let him get away with this." "I'm thinking about it," Sarah typed back. "I don't know what to do yet, but I'm not letting him get away with it." She sat in silence for a few minutes, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't want to just vent. She wanted action. She wasn't sure what form it would take, but she could feel the power of something bigger than herself building inside her. The idea that she could be an instrument of change, that her story could stand for more than just her own personal experience, was both humbling and empowering. That's when it hit her. What if she used her voice? What if she shared her story with the world? Not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, for every person who had been judged by the color of their skin, or the way they looked or the life they lived. She could expose the ugliness of this kind of discrimination. She wasn't powerless. In fact, she was in a position to do something that would challenge the status quo. Social media had given ordinary people like her a platform. She could tell her story, and people would listen. Michael Thompson had made a mistake by thinking he could treat her like she didn't matter. Now she would make sure the world knew the truth. The next day, Sarah went to the local coffee shop and sat down with her laptop. She began to write. She poured her anger, frustration, and resolve into every word. She wasn't just recounting an event. She was telling the world that this kind of behavior would no longer be tolerated. "Yesterday, I was kicked out of the Oak Ridge Hotel. The manager, Michael Thompson, told me that I didn't belong there. That people like me didn't fit the image of the hotel. But let me tell you something. I do belong. I belong in every space, just as much as anyone else. The color of my skin, the way I dress, where I come from. None of that should ever determine whether I'm welcome. No one should ever be made to feel like they don't belong because of who they are." She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could feel the weight of her words, the power in them. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a much larger fight for equality, for respect, for dignity. Sarah wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for anyone who had ever been made to feel small because of who they were. She hit send. The post went live, and within minutes, notifications began to flood in. People began commenting, sharing, and offering support. Strangers who had never met Sarah began to share their own stories of discrimination, of being made to feel like they didn't belong. The hashtag Justice for Sarah quickly began to trend. The Oak Ridge Hotel and Michael Thompson were being thrust into the public eye, and there was no turning back. Sarah watched as her phone buzzed nonstop, each notification a reminder of the movement she had just sparked. It wasn't just about the hotel. It was about a cultural shift. It was about showing the world that no one should ever be treated as less than because of their background, their race, or their appearance. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration. What had she just done? She had put herself out there, exposed her vulnerability to the world. But she also knew that she couldn't back down now. She had taken the first step, and there was no going back. But Sarah wasn't just looking for justice anymore. She was looking for change. She had turned her pain into a powerful weapon, and she was ready to use it to fight for the dignity of everyone who had ever been marginalized. The Oak Ridge had no idea what was coming for them, but Sarah would make sure they never treated anyone that way again. Her battle had just begun. The power of the voice. The storm of responses to Sarah's post was overwhelming. What started as a single tweet quickly snowballed into something far more significant than she had ever anticipated. The hashtag Justice for Sarah had spread like wildfire across social media platforms, with thousands of users sharing their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. People from all walks of life, from all corners of the globe, had rallied behind her, offering their support, empathy, and experiences. It was as if a door had been opened, a floodgate that no one could close. The Oak Ridge Hotel's social media accounts, once pristine and filled with carefully curated images of luxury and elegance, were now besieged by a torrent of angry comments, demanding accountability for the actions of its manager, Michael Thompson. Articles began to appear in local and national news outlets, detailing the incident and the growing online movement. The story was no longer just about one woman's humiliation at the hands of a hotel manager. It had become a symbol of a much larger issue. The systemic biases that plagued society and the way certain people were denied spaces because of the color of their skin, their gender, or their socioeconomic status. Sarah sat in her small hotel room, glued to her phone, watching the events unfold. She had anticipated some level of attention, but nothing like this. The support was incredible. Strangers from different countries, different backgrounds, all coming together to fight for a cause that transcended her own experience. But there was also a darker side to the attention. Some of the comments were not so supportive. A handful of people accused her of playing the victim, of seeking attention, of making a mountain out of a molehill. The hate was there too, as it always seemed to be when issues of race and inequality were brought into the spotlight. But the positivity, the overwhelming flood of solidarity, far outweighed the negativity. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt a sense of power. She had a voice now, one that resonated with people far beyond her own circle. And with that power came a sense of responsibility. She wasn't just sharing her story anymore. She was leading a movement. She was showing the world that speaking up could make a difference. And she wasn't about to let it fizzle out. The Oak Ridge Hotel had, predictably, tried to sweep the incident under the rug. Their first response, a terse statement released through their PR department, was an attempt to distance themselves from Michael Thompson's actions. They claimed they were investigating the matter and assured the public that such behavior was not in line with the values of the Oak Ridge. But the words felt hollow, empty promises designed to pacify the masses, to quell the growing outrage. Sarah wasn't fooled. She knew that Michael's actions were not an isolated incident. This was a culture, a reflection of a system that had been allowed to perpetuate for far too long. Sarah decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She began to contact journalists, activists, and influencers who were vocal about issues of social justice. She didn't want to be just another viral story that would be forgotten in a week's time. She wanted real, tangible change. She wanted the world to understand that this wasn't just about one man's cruelty. It was about the systemic nature of exclusion and racism that was ingrained in even the most seemingly benign spaces. The Oak Ridge wasn't just a hotel. It was a microcosm of a society that often valued appearance over substance, wealth over character, and exclusivity over inclusivity. In the days that followed, Sarah's story gained more traction. She was invited to appear on talk shows, interviewed by podcasts, and even asked to write an op-ed for a prominent newspaper. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who had suffered similar indignities, but had never had the courage to speak out. Despite her growing public presence, Michael Thompson had remained silent. He had issued a brief apology, but it was a poor attempt at damage control. The public was no longer interested in apologies. They wanted action. They wanted accountability. Then, one afternoon, Sarah received a call from an investigative journalist named Mark Turner. Mark was known for his hard-hitting pieces on corporate corruption and social injustice. He told Sarah that he had been digging into Michael Thompson's past, and what he had uncovered was disturbing. "Sarah, I found something you need to hear," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. "Michael Thompson's not the man you think he is. The Oak Ridge may be the face of luxury and exclusivity, but behind the scenes, it's a different story." Sarah's heart began to race as she listened. Mark went on to explain that Michael Thompson had a history of discriminatory behavior, not just toward guests, but also toward employees. He had been involved in numerous incidents over the years, including allegations of mistreatment toward staff members of color, discriminatory hiring practices, and even accusations of sexual harassment. But each time, the hotel had swept it under the rug, choosing to protect their image over the well-being of those who worked for them. Mark's revelation sent a chill through Sarah. This wasn't just about one isolated incident. This was a man who had used his power to manipulate, to degrade, and to uphold a system that valued privilege above all else. The hotel, it seemed, was complicit in his behavior, enabling him to perpetuate his toxic attitude without consequence. "I'm going to expose everything," Mark said, his voice filled with conviction. "But I need your help. You're the face of this now. You've already started something big, and if we can get your story out there, along with the evidence I've uncovered, we can take this down." Sarah didn't hesitate. She knew this was her chance, her opportunity to bring real change. She agreed to work with Mark, and they began preparing for the expose. It would take weeks of careful investigation, interviews, and verification, but Sarah was determined. She wasn't going to let Michael Thompson or the Oak Ridge Hotel get away with what they had done. The stakes were higher now. Sarah wasn't just fighting for her own dignity anymore. She was fighting for the dignity of every person who had ever been made to feel inferior, overlooked, or unwanted because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. This was bigger than her. It was about dismantling a culture that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. Days turned into weeks as Mark continued to gather evidence. Sarah kept pushing forward, attending rallies, participating in interviews, and speaking at events that championed equality. The movement she had sparked was no longer just a reaction to one incident. It had become a force of its own, a beacon of hope for those who had long been marginalized and silenced. And all the while, Michael Thompson watched from the sidelines, growing increasingly frustrated as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. The Oak Ridge was under siege, its reputation tarnished by the very man who had helped build it. But Michael didn't know the full extent of what was coming for him. He hadn't yet realized that Sarah Williams wasn't just a victim. She was a force of change. And when the time came, the world would know the truth about what he had done. In the coming weeks, the hotel industry, along with every corporation that had ever looked the other way when it came to discrimination, would be forced to reckon with its own shortcomings. The Oak Ridge would be forced to reckon with the truth. Sarah had started a revolution, and it was only just beginning. The reckoning. Sarah stood on the balcony of her apartment. The city skyline stretched before her as the sun began to set. The golden light washed over the buildings, but it felt like a distant warmth compared to the turmoil she had been through. She had become something of a symbol in the fight against discrimination, a voice that echoed through social media and beyond. The journey from that fateful day at the Oak Ridge Hotel, when Michael Thompson had humiliated her, to now had been filled with both challenges and victories. But she knew it was far from over. As much as Sarah had gained from the outpouring of support, she also felt the weight of the responsibility that had come with it. She was no longer just Sarah Williams, a woman who had been unjustly treated in a luxury hotel. She was the voice for so many others who had been silenced by systems of power and privilege. She felt the burden of their stories on her shoulders, but she also felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just her fight, it was a collective one. Over the past few weeks, she had watched the tide turn. What had begun as an online movement had grown into something that reached boardrooms, newsrooms, and city halls. The Oak Ridge Hotel's reputation had been shredded, piece by piece, as more stories came to light about Michael Thompson's history of unethical and discriminatory behavior. Mark Turner's expose had hit the media like a bombshell, with each new revelation sending shockwaves through the hotel industry and beyond. But with all the noise and chaos came the inevitable pushback. The Oak Ridge Hotel's PR team, along with their legal department, had gone into full damage control mode. They issued statements, held press conferences, and tried to discredit Sarah, painting her as a disgruntled guest who had simply misinterpreted the events of that day. They even went so far as to suggest that Sarah's accusations were a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. It was clear that the Oak Ridge was not going to let this go quietly. They had resources, power, and influence. But Sarah had something just as valuable: the truth. And she wasn't going to back down. The day after Mark's expose was published, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this, but things are getting huge. They're calling for a boycott of Oak Ridge hotels. People are protesting outside of their locations. Even employees are speaking out. You've made this into a real movement." Sarah read the message with a smile, but it was bittersweet. She had become the center of a storm that was rapidly gaining momentum. The protests outside Oak Ridge properties were becoming more organized, with people demanding not just accountability for Michael Thompson's actions, but for a broader reckoning within the hospitality industry. Workers, bartenders, housekeepers, and bellhops had begun to speak out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by the hotel's management. The revelations about Thompson's abusive treatment of employees had sparked an uprising that no one had expected. The Oak Ridge was no longer a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. It had become a target for the very people it had exploited and marginalized. But the protests weren't just happening on the streets. They were happening online as well. Social media was flooded with stories from people who had been discriminated against by high-end businesses, stories of being turned away from restaurants, hotels, or events simply because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. The hashtag Justice for Sarah had morphed into something bigger, #Boycott Oak Ridge. It was as if Sarah's story had unleashed a wave of pent-up frustration that people were now expressing. No one was going to stay silent anymore. Yet, despite the growing support, Sarah knew there would still be those who doubted her or tried to dismiss her. The truth was that Michael Thompson, and those like him, still held power. They would fight back with everything they had. She had already begun receiving threats, anonymous messages, hateful comments, even veiled warnings that she should be careful with how far she pushed this. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She had stood up to the man who had tried to crush her spirit. Now, She would stand up to an entire system. But it wasn't just about taking down the Oak Ridge anymore. As Sarah had worked tirelessly, alongside Mark and others, to expose Michael Thompson's past, it became clear that the fight was much larger than any single hotel or individual. The entire hospitality industry, along with many other sectors, was built on exclusion and bias. The story of Michael Thompson wasn't unique. It was just a symptom of a much deeper issue. Sarah knew that the battle she was fighting was not just about making one man pay for his actions, but about changing an entire culture of discrimination that had been allowed to fester for far too long. With the pressure mounting, the Oak Ridge management had called an emergency meeting. Sarah knew that they were scrambling, trying to figure out how to salvage their reputation and mitigate the damage. The one thing they had never anticipated, though, was that Sarah wasn't going to stop. She wasn't interested in token apologies or promises of change that would never come to fruition. She wanted results, real, lasting change. It was during one of her evening interviews that Sarah made a bold decision. She was sitting in a studio with a prominent activist, and the conversation had turned to the broader issues of race and discrimination in the luxury sector. The activist was speaking about how many corporations paid lip service to inclusivity without taking any real steps to address the systemic inequalities in their hiring practices and customer service policies. That was when Sarah interrupted, her voice steady but unwavering. "Enough is enough," she said. "I'm done with the empty words and the fake promises. The time for talk is over. We need action. We need change. And we need it now." The word hung in the air, a declaration of war against the systems that had enabled men like Michael Thompson to thrive. The interview went viral within hours, and suddenly Sarah had become more than just a symbol. She had become a catalyst for the movement that was sweeping through not just the hotel industry, but every corner of corporate America. People were tired of waiting for things to change. They were ready to make things change. As the protests grew in size and intensity, Sarah continued to organize, not just for the boycott, but for a series of meetings with lawmakers and business leaders. She had started reaching out to those in positions of power, asking them to come together and address the systemic inequalities that had plagued their industries for so long. The movement had spread beyond the walls of Oak Ridge, and now it was demanding action on a national scale. The tipping point came when an investigative documentary team, working in partnership with Mark Turner, released a special on the Oak Ridge Hotel's treatment of both employees and guests. The documentary highlighted testimonies from former and current staff members, exposed the shady hiring practices, and delved into the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester under Michael Thompson's management. But it didn't stop there. The documentary also connected the dots between Oak Ridge's practices and the broader systemic issues within the hospitality industry. The documentary was the nail in the coffin for the Oak Ridge Hotel's reputation. The public outcry was deafening, and the pressure on the management became unbearable. After weeks of refusing to take full responsibility, the Oak Ridge management finally issued a statement that was as close to an apology as they would get. But it wasn't enough. The damage was done. The movement had already shifted public opinion. For Sarah, it was a bittersweet victory. She had fought for so long, and now finally, it seemed that justice was within reach. But it wasn't over yet. This was just one battle in a much larger war. The fight for equality and accountability was far from finished. As she looked out at the city skyline once more, she knew that the next step in her journey was about to begin. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. Unbreakable resolve. The noise from the protests outside Oak Ridge hotels had begun to fade, but the ripples of change were far from over. Sarah Williams had become more than just the face of the movement. She had become a force. A movement that once started with one woman's courage had transformed into a relentless call for justice and equity. She knew the battle wasn't over. While the Oak Ridge Hotel had been forced to answer for its mistakes, Sarah understood the true fight was not just about holding one man or one hotel accountable. It was about reshaping an entire industry, an entire system that had fostered inequality for generations. For weeks, the media had followed her every move. At first, it was exhilarating. The constant interviews, the headlines, the calls from organizations wanting to collaborate. But as time wore on, the pressure began to take its toll. The personal attacks intensified, with trolls from all corners of the internet hurling accusations of playing the race card or seeking fame. Some even criticize her for ruining a man's life over a single incident. Yet for every hateful comment, there were thousands of others in support. The strength of the movement had only grown, and Sarah refused to let the hate slow her down. Her relationship with her family had also become strained. Her mother, always the pragmatist, had cautioned Sarah about the potential consequences. "It's not easy fighting giants, honey," she'd said. "They'll come after you in ways you can't even imagine. Are you ready for that?" Sarah had smiled at her mother, assuring her that she was, and she was, but the weight of her newfound responsibility often felt overwhelming. There were moments of self-doubt when the enormity of what she was trying to accomplish seemed impossible. But when she felt like giving up, she thought back to that moment at the Oak Ridge Hotel when Michael Thompson had humiliated her in front of an entire lobby of guests. She had stood up in that moment, and in the weeks since, she had only grown stronger. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless other people who had been treated like she had. And she couldn't back down now. In the quiet moments, when the world seemed to stop and she could reflect, Sarah realized that what had started as a personal fight had evolved into a collective struggle. People from all walks of life, from different backgrounds, ages, and races, had joined her in her call for justice. Her story had resonated with so many, and she knew that this wasn't just her victory. It was theirs too. Together, they were all part of something much larger than any one individual. But despite the overwhelming support, the opposition remained formidable. The Oak Ridge Hotel, though weakened, was not yet broken. Michael Thompson was still employed, still firmly entrenched in his position of power, despite the increasing pressure from the public. The hotel's leadership, too, had remained silent on his future, not willing to confront the deeper issues that were now laid bare. The system that had allowed him to thrive was still in place, and Sarah knew that dismantling it would take more than just protests and online movements. It would take sustained action, policy changes, and most importantly, a shift in how people viewed power and privilege. With that realization, Sarah took a step further into the world of activism. She didn't want to be just a voice on social media or a symbol of outrage. She wanted to be a catalyst for tangible change. So she began organizing. She called meetings with business leaders, policymakers, and activists. She spoke at conferences, not just about her personal experience, but about the systemic barriers that existed in the world of business. She began to build relationships with key figures in industries that had long ignored the voices of the marginalized. It was a slow and sometimes frustrating process, but Sarah knew it was the only way to create lasting change. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was from a woman named Carla Mitchell, a senior executive at one of the largest hotel chains in the country. Carla had been following Sarah's journey and was deeply moved by her courage. She wanted to talk. "I know the fight you're in, Sarah," Carla said when they finally connected, "and I want to help." Carla explained that her company had already begun implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives in response to the growing demands for accountability in the hospitality industry. However, she admitted that it hadn't been enough. They had been reactive, not proactive. Carla wanted to change that. She wanted Sarah to join her team as a consultant, helping her company and others in the industry overhaul their policies, hiring practices, and customer service protocols. "It's time to go beyond just statements and pledges," Carla said. "We need to make real, measurable changes that can be a model for the rest of the industry. And we need someone like you, Sarah, to help us lead the way." Sarah sat back, stunned. This wasn't just an opportunity to speak at a conference or write an op-ed. This was a chance to make real institutional changes that could impact not only the hospitality industry, but other sectors as well. It was a chance to reshape how businesses approached diversity, inclusion, and accountability on a large scale. But it also meant diving even deeper into the system she had spent so many months trying to tear down. "Why me?" Sarah asked, unsure if she was the right person for such a monumental task. Carla paused for a moment before responding. "Because you have something they can't ignore. You have the courage to take them on. You've already shown the world what you're capable of. And that kind of strength can't be underestimated." Sarah felt a swell of emotions. She had come so far in such a short time, but she knew this was the next step in her journey. It was a chance to not just fight the system from the outside, but to work within it and change it from the inside out. It was a chance to hold companies accountable, to push for policies that not only addressed discrimination, but actively worked to dismantle the barriers that had been built up over decades. She was terrified, but she was also ready. This was the challenge she had been waiting for. After a long night of reflection, Sarah accepted the offer. The next day, she called Mark Turner and told him about the opportunity. He was thrilled, though a bit concerned that her shift toward working with corporations could dilute the message she had worked so hard to build. But Sarah assured him that this wasn't about giving up the fight. It was about expanding it, about finding ways to make change from within the very institutions that had once protected people like Michael Thompson. "I'll still be out there fighting, Mark," Sarah said with conviction. "I'm not going anywhere. But now, I'm going to make sure they can't get away with it anymore. We'll hold them accountable, but this time, we'll be doing it from the inside. I'm not just going to change policies. I'm going to change hearts and minds. I'm going to show them that inclusivity and equality aren't just buzzwords. They're the future." With that, Sarah's journey took on a new chapter. She had already shaken the foundations of the Oak Ridge Hotel, but now she was ready to take on an entire industry. It wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. There would be setbacks. But Sarah had learned one thing over the past few months. Nothing could stop her now. She had started a revolution, and it was only just beginning. And with each step forward, she was closer to her ultimate goal. A world where every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could walk into any space and feel like they belonged. The work was just beginning, but Sarah was ready. The transformation. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's new role with the Hotel Industries Reform Initiative began to take shape. The challenges were immense, but so was the commitment she had to the cause. Her days were filled with boardroom meetings, strategy sessions, and roundtable discussions with executives from not only the hospitality sector, but also other major industries. Carla Mitchell, who had become a mentor of sorts, continued to support Sarah's every move, offering her expertise and guidance as they navigated the murky waters of corporate change. But as much as Sarah was consumed with her professional work, the emotional toll of the fight against systemic inequality remained constant. The momentum that had started with the viral protests against Michael Thompson and the Oak Ridge Hotel continued to build, and Sarah found herself speaking at conferences and forums across the country. Her voice was heard not only in business circles but in academic institutions, on social media, and at grassroots community meetings. People everywhere were listening. The movement had spread beyond the confines of the hotel industry. It had become a nationwide push for justice, equity, and inclusion. But as Sarah's influence grew, so did the resistance. Many of the powerful figures she had once believed would welcome change began to show their true colors. There were whispers behind closed doors about Sarah's influence growing too powerful, about how the calls for diversity were threatening the status quo. She could feel the tension mounting, especially from those who had benefited from the current system of exclusion. It wasn't easy to challenge decades of ingrained practices and beliefs. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Sarah sat in her apartment, nursing a cup of tea as she read through a stack of reports and proposals that had come across her desk. Her phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Sarah, you've been at this for so long. Have you thought about taking a break?" Sarah smiled at the message but didn't respond immediately. She had learned to keep going even when her body and mind begged for rest. But Vanessa's words struck a chord, and Sarah allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought back to her original fight, to that defining moment when Michael Thompson had thrown her out of the Oak Ridge Hotel. She had never planned to start a revolution. She had never imagined she would be the face of an industry-wide movement. But now, there was no turning back. Her resolve had only grown stronger, though the weight of the responsibility often felt suffocating. Still, Sarah knew that taking a break wasn't an option, not now. Not when so many were counting on her to keep pushing, to keep speaking out, to keep breaking down the barriers that had kept so many people from finding equal footing. A few days later, as Sarah was preparing for an important presentation to a group of executives from a top luxury hotel chain, she received a call from Mark Turner. His voice was strained as he spoke. "Sarah, I've been following your progress, and I have to say, what you're doing is incredible. But I need to warn you about something." "What is it, Mark?" she asked, sensing the gravity in his tone. "The people you're fighting against, they're not going to let you win. They won't just sit back and let you take down everything they've built. There's going to be pushback, and it's going to get ugly. I'm hearing things from sources inside Oak Ridge and other organizations. They're preparing for a counterattack. They're organizing, and they're not afraid to use their power to protect the system that's worked so well for them." Sarah's heart sank. She had known that resistance was inevitable, but hearing it from Mark, someone who had seen the inner workings of the industry, made it feel all the more real. "I know, Mark," she said quietly, "but I didn't come this far to back down. I can't let these people continue to oppress others just because it's easier for them to maintain their power. I won't stop, and I won't be intimidated." After ending the call, Sarah sat in silence for a while, processing Mark's words. She wasn't naive. She knew how powerful her opponents were, but she also knew how powerful the movement she had helped create had become. It was bigger than her now. It was about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to fight the same battles she had fought, that the people coming up behind her would inherit a world that was more inclusive, just, and equitable. The following week, she was faced with the reality of the growing opposition. As she walked into the boardroom to present her new diversity initiatives to a group of hotel executives, she could sense the hostility in the air. The room was cold, the smiles forced. These were the same people who had spent decades building the exact systems she was now trying to dismantle. They were reluctant to change, and some were outright resistant. As Sarah began her presentation, explaining the steps needed to create inclusive environments for employees and guests alike, she was interrupted by a senior executive. "Ms. Williams," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "while we respect your passion, we have some concerns about how these changes will affect our bottom line. You're asking us to overhaul systems that have worked for us for years. And for what? A few more diverse faces in the lobby. We're talking about real money here." The words stung, but Sarah held her ground. "What you're talking about isn't just about money. It's about human lives. It's about fairness. If your company can't make the simple decision to include everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, then what kind of message are you sending to the world? This isn't a trend, it's a movement. And you can either be part of it, or you can be left behind." The silence in the room was deafening. She could see some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others sat with arms crossed, clearly ready to fight back. But Sarah didn't flinch. She spoke with the authority that had come from months of fighting, the strength she had built by standing her ground time and time again. As the meeting continued, it became clear that the executives were divided. Some were open to the idea of change, realizing that the world was moving in a direction they could no longer ignore. But others were firmly entrenched in their beliefs, unwilling to budge. Sarah knew she wouldn't be able to win them all in one sitting, but she also knew that she had made her point. This was no longer just a conversation about diversity. It was a conversation about the future of business itself. When the meeting ended, Sarah felt a sense of exhaustion, but also a quiet sense of victory. She had pushed the conversation forward, even if she hadn't changed every mind in the room. The fight wasn't over, but every small win brought her one step closer to the world she dreamed of. That evening, as Sarah walked out of the building, she felt the weight of everything she had been through. The fights, the victories, the setbacks, all of it had led her to this moment. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing: she was ready. The movement was unstoppable, and Sarah Williams was at the heart of it, leading the charge toward a future where equality wasn't just a dream, it was a reality.